So, although the title of my speech is Other EU Legislation and Regulatory Developments, I'm actually not going to talk of either legislation or regulatory developments in the pharma sector. I'm going to talk about 3 different issues that have an impact on the pharmaceutical sector. The first one is the access to judgment documents case. I know you talked about it late yesterday. That's not really what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why you need to choose your battles. I am a very old lawyer. I've been doing this for 35 years. My first client was Beecham. Anybody remember Beecham? Yes. Somebody remember Beecham, please. So my first client was Beecham. So I started with practice in 1985 with Beecham as one of my first clients to the completion of the internal market. So choosing your battles are really important. The second is the new IVD legislation that's coming up. And it's supposedly 2022, that's not very far away, because it includes for the first time companion diagnostics. So there are various issues there that we will talk. And finally, and fleetingly, I will talk about Brexit, anything that hasn't changed since I started talking about this morning. So between the time that I prepared my slides and I sent them, it changed. So this is a very moving target. We all know this. So that part will be quite brief. So let's start with the cases. Now you know all about this. You know about the cases. So the reason that I chose these cases to talk about is not the judgment. This was a judgment on appeal. It was never going to be high-flying law because judgments on appeal aren't. The judge takes the decision of the General Court, it checks it to make sure it has the correct legal basis, it correctly applied the law to the facts, and it came to the correct judgment. So you're never really going to get major leading cutting-edge case law when you go to appeal a court case. So the thing is that the fact is, if you go to the court and you tell the court, I want my entire document redacted, the court is going to say the same thing as the Medicines Agency said, I really don't think so. You're wasting your time. Choose your battles. You annoy the agency, you annoy the court, you spend a lot of money and you're never going to win. You're just not going to. That's not the way it starts, because we're starting from the basic principle in the Access to Documents regulation. It is supposed to be as open as possible. There are very rare exceptions on the Access to Documents provisions, and it's really important to keep that in mind. I absolutely understand. Like I said, I've been doing this for a very long time. I represent the pharma industry. I represent the device industry. I represent mostly innovative companies. I know the billions of dollars that they spend in getting their product through to marketing authorization. And that is why I am cautious, because the court follows precedent. That means that what is the judgment of the court today will be the judgment of the court tomorrow. So when the court, I'm going to skip to this, when the courts start telling us that there is no presumption of confidentiality, there's no general presumption of confidentiality, that's the case for the future. Now, the thing is that the way the court said it is not, it doesn't, if I were to summarize it to you now, the court says there's no general presumption of confidentiality. That's not really what it said. It said that there are certain circumstances in which confidentiality can be permitted. But if I were going to court in 2 years or 2 months from now, and I was seeking an access to documents, that's the phrase I'm going to focus on. There's no general presumption of confidentiality. So this is why it's really important to choose your battles. Because unless you can distinguish, it's the term, it basically means you have to be able to choose to demonstrate that something's different, and that the court case that you're in and the facts and the law are different to the facts and the law of these 2 cases. You have to be able to distinguish, or the court will simply say, the court will say this, would you like to go and read this judgment? court will say that. I'm a former F1 there. I'm familiar with what they say. Particularly if you seek an application in a preliminary ruling, that is where you go to a national court and you say, I want to question, I'm taking this action and my action is based on European law, and there is a provision of European law that I don't think is clear, and you should go to court and go to the European Court, Mr. Judge, and ask the European Court of Justice this question about the interpretation of a piece of European law. So if you did that on an access to documents case, essentially the national court sends the question to the big court, as we called it, in Luxembourg, and the court looks at it, and it comes to people like me, that I found there, and we look at it, and then we look at the case law. And then, if necessary, the registrar of the court will write back to the national court and say, did you see this case? Did you apply it? Do you think you really need us to answer this case now? That's the consequences of cases like this. So you really need to choose your battles, because what impacts you now will also impact you in the future. Choose your battles. I have to be honest, quite often I will discourage my clients from going to court, because I've been doing this long enough to know what you're likely to win and what you're likely not to win. And going to court and asking for a blanket refusal to access documents is one of the cases you're likely not to win. So this is my case on the case law. So this is the case that particularly interests me. So why am I talking about the in vitro diagnostic legislation? Because it's going to change. 2022, we're going to have the IVD regulation. What is important about that, among many, many things, is that it introduces a specific inclusion into the definition of an IVD of a companion diagnostic, something that has never been in existence before. So there are going to be two different types of impact, apart from all the regulatory stuff. Either a product that is currently used as a companion diagnostic but not classified as a medical device may become one. And more complicated, but one that we're currently seeing, is a product that is currently classified as a medical device may be reclassified as an IVD. And given that the medical device legislation will change on the 26th of May this year, it's useful to focus on that. Of course, if some of you may be very familiar with the changes going on, I'm not going to focus on too much on the procedures, but it is more, let's start with, why do we need a new piece of legislation? Well, we've had legislation, we've had the first sets of legislation from 1990, 91, 93, like I said, I've been doing this for a while, and then we had 1998, we had the IVD directive. And it frankly wasn't awfully good, in the sense that it was very general. And it basically had a very broad definition of what an IVD was, and most IVDs were CE marked by self-assessment. So one of the senior officials of the FDA made some really critical comments about the fact that basically IVDs on the EU market were absolutely not regulated and a danger to health, and altogether not very flattering. So since 2008, we have been discussing a change of legislation. It took from 2008 to 2016 to get there. So now we got this new legislation that enters into force. It is more sophisticated. It doesn't necessarily introduce too many more obligations, honestly. If you follow the obligations that are in the current Med Devs, and the Med Devs are the guidance documents, there is, you're quite a bit forward. But the important thing is that you need a notified body. And as there are currently only 11 notified bodies designated to the legislation, in fact, there are 11 to the medical devices regulation and 3 to the IVDR, it's really important to start thinking about it. This is why we're talking about it now. So it entered into force 2017, not 16, and It applies to from the 26th of May 2022, unless it doesn't. And it will only not apply to those IVDs that already have a valid C certificate of conformity issued by a notified body that relates to an IVD that will not change. That doesn't include companion diagnostics, because companion diagnostics have never been within the scope of the legislation. So we're starting in a whole new world of legislation, regulation of companion diagnostics. Now, why am I keeping banging on about this? It is because if you are developing a clinical trial for a medicinal product at the moment, and you want to have a companion diagnostic, the rules governing that are currently governed by the national law of the individual member states, which varies substantially. The most important point to keep in mind is, if you're going to use a companion diagnostic in your clinical trial, and there is a possibility that it should be a medical device, if you don't CE mark it, if you don't use a CE marked medical device, then when you go through all the way through your clinical trial and spend many millions on conducting the trial, you may face, and we've faced this, when the GCP inspectors come from the Medicines Agency. So you've used this companion diagnostic, you've used this assay, you've used this medical device, so can you please show us the technical file and the CE mark? What do you do if you haven't got one? It takes a lot of discussion. And we've been through these discussions, particularly over the last 18 months, with the Medicines Agency, because they are asking things. I have to say, sometimes they're asking they're arguing the inarguable. It wasn't classified as that then. How can you expect us to retro-classify? But you have to be ready to address this point. So, what is the important parts? It introduces, expands the scope to include companion diagnostics. It reclassifies products, as I said earlier. Some devices that were currently medical devices under the medical device legislation will become IVDs. You will need to have clinical data, directly relevant clinical data. That doesn't mean you've got to go and conduct a clinical investigation. But it does mean you need to have clinical relevant data, and you must have a clinical evaluation report for any companion diagnostic or any medical device that you use in a clinical trial of a medicinal product from 26th of May this year. So we have all the legislation of self-testing, more stringent documentation, greater scrutiny by notified bodies. At the moment, more than 80% of all IVDs are self-assessment. Come the entry into force of the IVDR, 80% and more of IVDs will require the intervention of a notified body. There are not enough notified bodies now. There probably won't be enough then. So if you feel you're going to start using an IVD, now is the time to do something about it. Talk to a notified body, discuss what you're going to do, start developing your technical file. And if you are the pharma part, make sure that the medical device manufacturer, the IVD manufacturer, the lab product manufacturer is aware of these concerns and addresses these with you when they supply the product with you. Now, I've just mentioned lab products. In the EU, we have medical devices and we have IVDs. That's it. We do not have a third category of lab products, unlike the US. If a product falls within the definition of an IVD, it's an IVD, whether or not it's used in a lab. Again, this is really important for you if you are using these products when you're conducting a clinical trial of a medicinal product. You have to be able to demonstrate that the safety and the efficacy of the medical device, of the IVD, of the companion diagnostic has been demonstrated in accordance with the provisions of the legislation. And they are really quite clear. So we're going to go from some not really much classification to 4 very specific classifications of IVDs. There's going to be a low risk version, low individual risk, low public health risk. Second, moderate individual risk, low public health risk. high individual risk and or moderate health risk. They tend to go together. They say and or, but it's normally and. High individual risk, high public health risk. That's how it's going to be categorized. This is a big difference to what we have now. So the risk that a device is going to be reclassified is very high, because it's just a new set of rules. So what are the obligations on the IVD manufacturer? If you are not the IVD manufacturer, you don't have to comply with this, but you need to be sure that the manufacturer who's supplying the IVD to you has complied with these. That means they need to have design and manufacturing according to the IVDR. That essentially means they need to be certified to the applicable ISO standards, international standards. And it's not enough for them to tell you, we follow those standards. They have to be able to demonstrate to you that they have been audited to and certified to that. Why do I know that? Because I did have a situation a little while ago in which a testing laboratory on their website says, we follow the ISO standards and labs. And I wasn't very comfortable, but it was only lab available. So the client went to this lab and had their device tested, and they it was a sterilization issue, very important with IVDs and medical devices. They then brought it to the authorities in an individual member state because they'd had problems. And the first thing the authorities said was, show us a certificate from the lab. There was no certificate. The lab had followed the rules and very probably did them very well, but they hadn't been audited. They didn't have the proof. So the authorities refused to accept any of the lab results. Had to go start back, do it again. It cost delay, it cost money. So they need to demonstrate conformity, safety and effectiveness to the IVD. They need to keep the documentation. They need to develop technical documentation. They need to develop clinical evaluation reports. It's all parts of, and I know this seems huge for a companion diagnostic, but there is no exception. There is no de minimis when it comes to compliance with the legislation. So, clinical evaluation. What do you have to do to get a clinical evaluation? You have to demonstrate that you have a defined methodologically sound procedure that is scientific, analytical and clinical performance. All three of those criteria need to be fulfilled. It must permit scientific demonstration by reference to the state of art in medicine, that the intended clinical benefits will be achieved and that the device is safe. Now, one of the other issues that we have encountered recently with the GCP inspectors from the Medicines Agency are that they not only want to see how the device has been demonstrated safe and effective, companion diagnostic or an assay or whatever type of IVD or medical device it is, they also want to see the design history file. And of course, the first question there is, do they have the right? Do they have the right to ask for the design history file for companion diagnostic, which wasn't actually a companion diagnostic when the trial started? They say yes, we say no. This is an ongoing discussion we've been having with an authority as to whether or not they have this. The problem with this is, if you don't engage with the inspectors and you don't engage with the agency or with the competent authorities, your application for authorization grinds to a halt. You've got to find a solution, but you need to be aware that there's a problem in the first place. And the issues that we have encountered, and we're currently dealing with 3 different versions of this, is that nobody knew it was a problem until the inspectors came and started asking questions. So the evidence derived from performance evaluation must provide scientifically valid assurance that the relevant general safety performance requirements are fulfilled, that it fulfills its intended purpose for which you are using it. Clinical performance studies must be carried out unless it's duly justified to rely on other sources of clinical performance data. Now that's different to the medical device legislation. The medical device legislation, you can, if you find other sources of information that demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of your device other than a clinical investigation, you can rely on them. Here, relying on other sources of information is an exception rather than the rule. So, rule 3. So remember we talked here about the 4 classes of device, and one of them was C, high individual risk and or moderate public health risk. So what do they, the way the legislation applies in the EU when it comes to medical devices is they give you a definition of a medical device, they give you a definition of an IVD, broad, and then they give you all these instructions how to achieve the obligations. But they don't tell you how to achieve them. Because one of the fundamental differences between a medicinal product procedure and a medical device procedure is, in a medicinal product procedure, you've got the common technical document, you've got the notice to applicants, you follow it, you've got your clinical data, you go to the agency, you go to the competent authorities, come out the other side with an authorisation. The quality, safety, efficacy of this medicinal product has been acknowledged by the relevant authority. With a medical device, with an IVD, with a companion diagnostic, there's none of that. You're given rules, you're told to follow them, but there is nobody on the end to say you did it right. There is, to an extent, a notified body. They will look at your technical documentation, they will look at your clinical documentation, they will ask questions. If they're happy, they will issue your CE certificate of conformity. But the determination of whether or not you want to put the product on the market, and the liability, if you do, lies entirely with you. There is no authority to which you can go and say, but you said it was okay. And this really puts an additional layer of responsibility on you when you are developing an IVD. And the thing is that although an IVD, there are some marvellous, marvellous IVDs out there, companion diagnostics out there, but the thing is that they look some of them look quite simple. And they are quite simple sometimes. But the fact is, simplicity has no dictation of your regulatory obligations. Whether it's a simple companion diagnostic, whether it's a very sophisticated MRI scanner, you still have to follow the same procedures. So, Rule 3 says that devices shall be classified as Class C, high patient risk, moderate public health risk, if they fall within these products, and one of them is if they're being used as a companion diagnostic, if they're being used for screening, diagnosis, or staging of cancer. The screening issue is causing a lot of discussion because there's no definition of what screening means. Essentially, it seems to be you'll know it when you see it. It's not terribly helpful. And for human genetic testing. Now, human genetic testing, again, at the moment, with T-cell therapy, with advanced therapy products, any product that is being used to treat a patient requires a genetic test before the patient is treated. The vast majority of genetic tests that are on the market in the EU at the moment are not CE marked. Now, I have spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of years with clients. We help them develop their clinical trials, their informed consent, data privacy, all that good stuff. And one of the things that we have continuously bumped against with the member states is the use of a genetic test. So some member states will not permit it at all. Some do not require a CE mark, which is a bit odd, and some do. So this is like the companion diagnostic. If you're going to start a clinical trial of your cell therapy, and a basic requirement of that is that the patient undergoes a genetic test before they are treated with the product. From now on, we really advise that you use a genetic test that has been CE marked. Because you're going to face the inspectors coming to your door and saying, that's great, that's great, that's great. Where's the CE mark for your genetic test? This is where medical device, pharma interact, and the determination and classification of a product now and in the future collide. And it's like the GDPR in clinical trials. You know the way they conflict with each other sometimes? This is the same sort of thing. And it's really important that you're aware of it, because you really don't want to go to the end of your trial and then have somebody question something that you simply didn't think about. So you're going to have this device is going to be a class 3 device. What does that mean? Now, again, unless you're an IVD manufacturer, the procedure is not going to apply to you. But as the manufacturer and the sponsor of a clinical trial for a pharmaceutical product, you're going to have to make sure that this has been complied with. That means if you buy a product, which you can do, you're going to buy a genetic test to conduct your clinical trial. From now on, you're probably going to have to go and audit them. You're going to have to audit the manufacturer. You're going to have to make sure they're ISO 13485. You'll hear that a lot. This is the standard for medical device manufacturers. It's not an EU standard, it's an international standard. So you need to be sure that the IVD manufacturer is compliant as a manufacturer, is legally permitted to manufacture, and has fulfilled all the obligation we're going to gallop through here, that they have been fulfilled. I know this is all new. I do apologise, but it's going to come. So, first of all, because it's a class 3, what kind of clinical data do you have to? You can do it in various ways. There used to be a possibility of equivalence of a predicate device. Basically, it's like a generic and a medicinal product. So you've got the medicinal product and you have the generic saying, me too. A predicate device is a bit the same. You've got an innovative device, and then you've got another device saying, I am essentially similar to that device. Until a couple of years ago, that was quite common. Now it's very difficult, and now it's going to become even more difficult, because to claim equivalence, you're going to have to demonstrate that you have a contract in place with the original manufacturer that explicitly allows the manufacturer of the second device full access to the technical documentation to the first device on an ongoing basis. So essentially, you are going and you're asking an innovative manufacturer to give you access to the commercially confidential information on an ongoing basis. Yeah, they're going to do that, aren't they? This comes back to access to documents, commercially confidential information. So the original clinical evaluation must be performed in accordance with the requirements of the IVD or the regulation. Not yet into force, but in 2 years' time it will be. By which time, if you want to go put your product on the market immediately, you're going to have run your clinical trials starting now. The device has been demonstrated to be equivalent to the marketed device and endorsed by a notified body. Do you know what a notified body is? So, a notified body is a body designated by member states and an individual member state to conduct a conformity assessment of a medical device or an IVD to the applicable law. They are not government authorities. Really important to remember that. They are expensive private companies. They can be very demanding. Some of them are absolutely great. Some of them not so. So you need to choose carefully, but you have to have one. Be prepared to be organised with them. Listen to what they're saying. They cannot give you advice. They cannot perform consultancy roles. But they do have responsibility to assess your technical file. So follow their guidance. A lot of these notified bodies are very well established, very sophisticated. They really know what they're doing. They're very expensive. So you don't want to go through it more than once. The notified body must check the PMCF, post-marketing clinical follow-up study, and must include market studies to demonstrate safety and performance. Now, these are all things that you're going to have to check when you start using an IVD in your clinical studies. So, I think we're going to start. Periodic safety update reports. Again, this is something that you're going to want to ask for. You're going to want to see this. You know the way you have to do a PSUR for your medicinal products? Medical device manufacturers don't have to do that yet, but they will have to do in the future. And you want to see that. You want to see that that there has been a PSUR for a device. Keep in mind, as I said, a companion diagnostic is going to be a Class C device. It's going to need a notified body. It's going to need a certificate of conformity. It's going to need a CE mark if you're going to use them in your clinical trials. The report must include a rationale and description of preventive and corrective actions, and throughout the lifetime of the device, it could be 20 years, that this PSUR must set out the conclusions of the benefit risk, the main findings of PMCF, and the volume of sales of the device, and an estimated valuation of the size and other characteristics of the population using the device. Now, that's something you're not going to see in the pharma sector. But why do they want to see this? They want to see that the use of a companion diagnostic in normal circumstance of use demonstrates on an ongoing basis that it has the safety and effectiveness of the IVD. Why is it important? Because if you start getting false positives, or even worse, false negatives, with your companion diagnostic, you could be putting the patient at risk. So transitional provisions, this is not relevant to you. So we're going to talk about Brexit. Well, we're not really. So we know much to say. I can only say what I have been saying for the last 3 years. I'm really sorry, I don't know. 3.5. Getting to 3.5 years. We still really don't know. What do we know? We do know that if you have a product, and if you're not there now, you really need to think about this. If you have a medicinal product that has central authorization, and you have the central marketing authorization holder in the UK, you need to move it. If you haven't done it yet, you really, really need to do it. You need to establish another marketing authorization holder has to be established in another EU, one of the 27 EU member states. A branch office won't do. It has to be an establishment. The fact that the term establishment is different in individual member states, beside the point, the one thing that is consistent in what our experience is that a branch office won't do. A branch office is not considered to be an establishment, because we keep having Swiss entities or UK entities that have a branch office in various member states, and they go to try and register, and either the Medicines Agency or the competent authorities in the member states say, that won't do, it's not. It's only a branch office. And even if it's populated with 100 people, it's still only going to be a branch office. So you need to move your marketing authorization from the UK. Data privacy rules may vary. I mean, data privacy rules already vary between member states, as I'm sure you're all aware. So it is possible that the GDPR the application of the GDPR in the UK will change. The GDPR is already part of the national law of the UK. So it's at the short term, it should not change. But we cannot anticipate if there is a variation in the GDPR in the EU, which I'm not sure anybody could face in the short term, but you never know. That will not become law in the UK. If the UK authorities decide to vary the UK version of the GDPR, it will not need to follow the EU legislation anymore. So you could find an inconsistency. That doesn't need to be fundamentally important. But what it is important for is, if again, multi-jurisdictional clinical trials, including the UK, you need to keep in mind that a consent, a transfer of data, a storage of data, they're all going to change, because at the moment, I can say even at the moment, not sure, but we think at the moment, if you conduct a clinical trial and you generate data in Germany and Belgium and France and Italy, and you send it to the UK for processing, there is no specific obligations to send it to a third country. If after the 31st of December this year, we don't have some kind of an agreement on the GDPR with the UK will become a third country. There is no, what's the name of the decision that I can never remember? There's, no. What do you call the decision the European Commission gives that I never remember? No, adequacy, thank you. Why do I not remember? There's no adequacy decision for the UK. There is currently no, as far as I'm aware, no steps on the part of the European Commission to adopt an adequacy decision for the UK. So essentially, the UK will become the equivalent of the US. So if you're going to take steps to transfer your data to the UK, you're going to need to either have common contractual clauses, an intercompany agreement, which really only works if you're a big company, or the prior written informed consent of the patient. Unless you can try some of these other obligations like legitimate interest or public interest, all of which I personally am a bit wary of because we really don't know the scope of those. But you're going to have to think about all those things, and we never had to think about that sort of thing before. Manufacturing rules may vary. If you have, at the moment, if you're manufacturing, you need a manufacturing certificate. A lot of third country manufacturers have their manufacturing certificate issued by the MHRA because it's a very respected agency. That's not going to be possible after the end of the year. It might be, but it doesn't look like it is. So you're going to have to keep in mind where your product is manufactured and on the basis of what kind of a manufacturing certificate. Batch release rules. You're probably not going to be able to batch release from the UK after the 31st of December. There are some people who say you can't even do it now, but that's a long discussion. That's a discussion for another day. It is thought that I tend to transfer to my lovely colleagues in the UK who really work with this. So we tried to keep as simple as we could what is going to happen. So this is what I have to say. This comes from my lovely colleagues in the UK. They sent me this yesterday. This is what it is. They have the commitment from the government to make the UK the leading global hub for life science after Brexit. That's just great. But that's not really what we want to hear. We want to hear how they're going to do it. So they have the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill. It's just been introduced in Parliament. It has some very interesting provisions. And interesting is not always good, but it's interesting. The intention is to create a framework within the UK that is to make the UK competitive, which I find a little bit odd because they were already competitive. But okay. The risk that we have is that the UK government has already said that it will not follow EU rules. It is not going to be a rule taker, it's going to be a rule maker. I'm not really sure what that even means, but that's what the Prime Minister said, so must be right. So you could find quite soon already inconsistencies of approach between the UK and the rest of the EU. It doesn't mean that it's bad, it means it's an inconsistency, which the current way that you're able to do business through 28 countries changes to you can do it between 27. You just need to be aware. The key points is that there is going to be claims of close regulatory alignment and cooperation, which absolutely contradicts what the UK government is saying, and no increase in trade friction, which again, I don't know if any of you saw the report from yesterday, Monsieur Barnier last night. Oh well, it didn't go very well. The first week of negotiations didn't go very well, but still got to the end of the year. One of the leading trade bodies have described the negotiated mandate as not as ambitious as we hoped. I don't know what that means. And they were particularly concerned with medicinal products, the range of laws not being as consistent and broad as I'd hoped. They do contain a mandate on an annex on medicinal products on mutual recognition of good manufacturing practice, of batch testing, in lines with the CETA. Now, that's actually a realistic possibility that we will get that. It might take a while, but I'm really hoping that mutual recognition in that area will be achieved. And a commitment to cooperate in relation to pharmacovigilance and patient safety. Again, we would like to see that happen. There is already a certain amount this is not a trailblazer. We do it with the US and various other countries already. So we do have a pattern to follow. Also, and this depends on the day of the week and the hour of the day, but the UK tends to model the relationship between the MHRA and the Medicines Agency on that between the Medicines Agency and the Swiss, US, Canadian authorities when it comes to information sharing. I really hope that happens. So what does the Medicines and Medical Device Bill say? It's intended to provide, as I say, continuity of the legislation outside the EU, but it improves, among other things, there are quite a few, quite a big law, proposes innovative regulation of novel therapies, precision medicines and complex medical devices via a distributed manufacturing mode for products for use either inside or outside clinical trials. That big long phrase essentially is the expectation is that clinical trials of certain types of products may become less robust. Is that good? Who knows? There are those who say that current EU rules, and if it ever comes into force, clinical trials regulation, are just too sophisticated, too complex, they put too many burdens on the sponsor. What we understand this to say is that the UK may take a less complex, is that the right word, approach. But let's see how that works out. The UK won't be subject to the clinical trials regulation. That's a bit of a blow because there's a certain level of consistency that we rather hope for there. But it does include a mechanism to update current trials framework, including, and this is where it gets interesting, removing unnecessary and duplicative regulatory burdens for clinical trials, particularly the lowest risk trials. They're being influenced here by the US changes, the changes in the US laws. And to make it easier for researchers and companies to rapidly trial new medicines while also ensuring we're consistent with global standards and best practices. They want to loosen the rules a bit. What does that mean for you as a pharmaceutical industry? It means that if you are going to conduct a clinical trial in a site, you need to have a really quite robust clinical trial agreement. You need to be sure that the quality, safety, efficacy of the product is continuing to be respected so that the data that is generated can actually, A, not put the patient at risk, fundamentally, B, may be sufficiently robust and credible for you to be able to rely on it, not only in the UK, but in other member states, or indeed throughout the world. Oh, there you are. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much.